Hello, I am Colleen Vanderhyde. I worked for 4 years at the Chicago Tribune doing research for the reporters. I was an information specialist who worked on a lot of different stories that were award-winning and even a couple that won Pulitzers. The way that a newspaper is made is usually the day before it comes out, all of the editors get together at the end of the day and review the stories that had been assigned for the day and decide where they will be placed on the newspaper. I worked that Monday until about 10:30 at night, and the top news stories of the day were supposed to be Michael Jordan going to be returning to basketball, was going to be a mayoral primary who was going to win that. The Denver Broncos defeated the New York Giants 31-20 at the new Invesco Stadium that night. Other top news of the day were things about Chandra Levy and Curtis Gates, who was in the Hoop Dreams, had been shot. There was Jay-Z and had come out with a new album, and that was being reviewed. So those were what was going to be the headlines the next morning, on Tuesday morning, on 9/11. On September 11th, I got up, as I usually do, and walked my kids to school. A mom came up to me and told me that she had seen that, or heard on the radio, that a plane had flown into a building in New York, that I was imagining a small, Piper or a small propeller plane. I was not imagining a jet. I got home and there was another plane had struck. I was scheduled to be going into work, and as I'm hearing the city is closing down because of all the fear that any skyscraper was next. They were very concerned about the Sears Tower. So the city went into an emergency lockdown mode and closed down, and a lot of the corporations ordered their people to leave. I was driving on the Dan Ryan, and it was very, very quiet going in. The scene coming out, those people that were coming south and coming home, that was jam-packed, bumper to bumper. I had a need to go in and figure out why and who and what. And that was what drove a lot of the different reporters of the day. So a lot of the different reporters also covered the stories from the previous day. And here, by the time I got to work, the second tower, the North Tower, had collapsed. The information that was going on the radio that I was seeing was a very difficult thing to listen to as I was driving in, and it kind of filled me with an adrenaline to find out what was going on, what could I do to help the people that were looking for what was behind this. And we had over 3,000 names eventually to look up. We had a variety of information. So I came into the city in a way. I was able to find free parking. I had free parking for 2 days. Some of my colleagues also wrote to me, and we talk on various social media platforms. And one of my colleagues she wrote that it was her second day coming back after maternity leave. Her babysitter was a no-show, so she was running a little late. Her mom came and watched her kids when she mentioned that a plane had crashed. We, of course, assumed it was an accident, and we all left for work. As my husband and I were driving into the city, the story continued to unfold on the radio. I can still feel the pit in my stomach and recall the feeling that sometimes that something that had gone terribly wrong. Then the second plane crashed. The office and the city felt so deserted. It was almost apocalyptic. I remember talking to another guy at the tower who, as it became clear that the crashes were deliberate terrorist attacks, we all were in shock. It was so surreal To this day, I wonder if I hadn't had that one day off back in the office, maybe I wouldn't have gone back at all after that maternity leave. The memory still shakes her to the core. We all had that pit in our stomach as we listened to the news unfold, and as we tried to recreate what was going on in the news, and figure out who these people were. We had no clue on spellings of their names, of how things would unfold, and we just went through reams of files and worked our way through the various offices and where the various materials were. We tried to get phone numbers and statistics and graphics. We wound up had published the first paper, was the early morning edition, hits the streets at about 5 o'clock in the morning. Then we published 2 more, what we call skins, that were wrapped around the main paper. The first one came out about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the second one later that day. And it was with all the information and research that we did during that time, because as news came out, things came out on wire services, and it was like just one-liners that come out on the Associated Press or the UPI news service. And with that limited information, we would have to do research and give to the reporters that were assigned by editors to do the various tasks. There were several that had gone up to O'Hare and to the train stations to find that transportation, of course, had been shut down. Cell phones shut down. There was nothing in the air, no transportation. People were jam-packed, waiting to get their transportation. And so they were camping out in the various areas of the country. One gentleman who was already in New York covering a story, he didn't have his cell phone wouldn't work, so he had to find a payphone, which becoming few and far between. And he wound up in Flatbush. And he was a newer reporter, and he was being assigned to go up and cover the Shanksville crash in Pennsylvania. He was driving, he was lost. He was in an area that didn't seem too safe for him, and he was very nervous. He called our desk, and I answered the phone, and I didn't really know how to tell him how to get out of New York City and the area that he was. So we had to try to find somebody in the building that had recently lived in New York City who could explain it to him. So we were able to look around, and Steve Hedges had some experience living there. He hadn't been there for a while, but he was able to talk our reporter out of Flatbush, and it was a very big relief that he was able to get out safely. But the guys on the street that he was so fearful of, they were happy to see, that he was able to go. And because I had asked him, I said, have you talked to those guys? Have you tried to do a story from them? And he did start to talk to them, but he was able to get up to Shanksville and do the story that he was assigned. This was the newsroom that day. We had people always had multiple computers on their desks, sometimes multiple phones. You never knew where a phone call was going to come from when you worked in the information center. Working in the information center was a bit like Trivia Pursuit on speed. You never knew if you were going to get a sport question, if you were going to get, something to do with the graphics, or how to do all the different names that started spitting out from the AP of people that were in the tower, the people that were on the planes, the ship's manifests, the crew manifests of these different planes. And then you also had to deal with language, and language was a bit of a difficulty because, we weren't all familiar with spellings of Arabic spellings, because it's more of a language which is pronounced rather than Americanized spelling. So we had to try to search with what we could on how to spell these names and how to try to figure out what had happened and why. And we were all like in a state of shock. And we still have, post-traumatic stress from that day. I was asked by a friend to locate if her brother-in-law who was supposed to work in the tower, had made it out. I had started getting calls from my own relatives asking about friends who worked down in New York City. And I was able to locate, through some reports, various people that were still missing, or people that had serendipitously, gotten up late. They had stayed up and watched the baseball game, and they went from there to, hitting their alarm clock a second time, the snooze button. So they just missed getting to work on time, which was fortuitous. One guy stopped off and he had a headache, so he went to Walgreens, and boom, that's when the planes hit. So there were little miracles of people who were managed to not get into work that day. Another person that remembered hearing on the news, we all glued ourselves to the TV that day. And again, we all thought Cessna at first. There was a lot of 2-year residents had started that day. Shia Campos was a 2-year resident who was supposed to chase the news and break stories. On 9/11, while senior reporters covered the attacks, the residents focused on those canceled flights, packed hotels, and Illinois families with relatives in the Trade Center. At 8 that day, she went to the Sears Tower to talk to people who worked in the building. They shared their worries about doing business in a high-rise. And when news that the second tower was hit, the interviews stopped and they fled home. It was a very exhausting day for the journalists and the researchers. The next day or soon after, residents were given a project. They had to write an obituary about every person who died in the attacks. So the assignment came out before anyone realized that the death toll would reach nearly 3,000. The Tribune operated as a national paper, so writing about the victims in New York was not far-fetched. So the researchers were given the names, and then we had to do what's called an auto track. It's almost like what is done with a credit check. You type in the name and the information, and you get people that are associated, maybe their job, maybe their relatives, and then the reporters would contact these people or the relatives to write the obituary to honor the person that had passed. The residents produced the obituaries daily. It was very difficult to be calling these people. With each interview, you had to revisit the attack. Family members talked about their loved ones and agonized over their last moments before the tragedies hit. The interviews for the reporters were lengthy. We had various survivors that would even call in, and we would try to, steer them to the reporter that was covering their person. The list of names grew as more people were identified in the rubble. Our stories ran every day, 2 years. I understand that the project wasn't completed, but the impact for readers and for the people there were life-changing. By finding a lot of the graphic information, we had done a report, The Gateway to Gridlock, the year before, which was about air traffic. So I had a lot of statistics and a lot of information about the airplanes themselves, and I was able to pass that on to those people that were doing the information about the equipment. We had information about what occurred. We had to look at the who, the whys. We couldn't really solve the whys, but we concentrated on the who's and the what's. Now, I worked with the obituary editor was James Shanaga, and there were 6 of us that worked in the research room. We would get all these names. So we'd get the quotes, and we had thousands of the obituaries. We had the missing persons memorials that went up with the phone calls that came in with horrifying losses of wives, husbands, children. boyfriends, parents, neighbors, etc. We spent months working off the research that our information specialists, myself, and 6 others, and partnered with. It was one of the first times that we partnered with our sister newspapers and did this research to split up the victims and assign them to reporters. Each reporter that was on this got the printed stacks of the research of the old addresses, phone numbers, addresses of relatives, a 1/4 inch of still warm paper and a neat paper clip in each corner. Each reporter was assigned 10 at a time. When they wrote 3, they were given 3 more. We joined their families in grief and hope when we had no hope. We always knew that they were gone. Even the young man whose new wife kept calling on his phone so he'd know that she loved him and so the rescuers would hear it. James watched as one of our police reporters put down the headset, heaved with sobs, and picked up the headset again. He never knew that I was there. It took 3 months. The Tribune called the families of each of the victims. We wrote about them all. This was the most affecting singular event that has occurred for me, and this is the first time I've spoken of it, and I didn't know how it'd be. As you can see, it still affects me today. Everything got shut down. Everything got canceled. We had a memorial in Pioneer Court, which is right next to the building. It was on the 14th of September. The 10 days that followed 9/11, all of the reporters were in shock. And I followed one who was assigned to get the pulse of the nation. His name was Rob Kaiser. And Rob, I had to find families for him to interview. He interviewed people that were in Michigan. He went to a Muslim family that was in San Francisco. He had Thanksgiving at an African-American family down in South, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was Mississippi. And it was where the young man was being deployed overseas. And I was a little worried about him when he went to a survivalist group out in Montana that were into prepping, and I didn't hear from him for a couple of days. And that was a worrisome time for me because the reporters all had different ways of contacting us. They could contact us by phone. We had our internal internet system and email system, and I also gave them my AOL. Things weren't as digital as they are now. You can just snap your cell phone at something and get a picture. You had to do a little bit more legwork to get reports and get information. These are some of the sites that I used to write my report and what you can use for getting more information. I also used there is a video that was produced by the Tribune called When Evil Struck America. So some of the materials we had to do. This is some of the graphics that I helped to investigate to give to the various reporters that would go on to write articles about and to support what was being written. These are some of the names and what we would write. And this was all done within about 3 months that it took to call all these people, because the names just kept coming. And we never knew what was going to be the final name or final topics. And we're still sifting through the various information. So this is Chicago on September 11th, when everything was being closed down. People scrambled for hotel rooms. The game was canceled, of course. There were threats at other places. Suspicious bags. They started sealing manhole covers and taking any of the newspaper boxes off the street. And it was a very emotional time, and still is. We kept following up with reports and then got into what was being said for various aftermath. You know, the debris and dust that covered the city was like snow falling, and they kept, a lot of the emergency management was saying this is not dangerous. And even to this day, there are first responders who are dying from some of what they inhaled back then. And their names are being placed along with the at the memorial for Ground Zero, which took years to build. The view from the Hoboken, New Jersey, across the river. The smoke just billowed for days. Is there any questions that anybody wanted to ask me? If there is no questions, I am going to sign out, and thank you for coming.